It is time for Money Power Politics, my favorite part of the show. And Silicon Valley's influence is becoming more clear in the new administration. Donald Trump announced over the weekend he would nominate two high-profile leaders from venture capital firm Andreessen Horowitz for top roles, one for the director of Office of Personnel Management and the other to advise on artificial intelligence policy. Here to discuss, Max Chapkin, Bloomberg Businessweek journalist and co-host of the Elon Inc. podcast, and Roger McNamee, an early Facebook and Google investor. He's also the author of Zucked, Waking Up to the Facebook Catastrophe. Max, back in the day, I remember when we saw a flood of Goldman Sachs top executives join the government, and a lot of people saw it as a big hustle, a way for them to defer paying their taxes. And now it's the tech guys are going to directly be involved in government activity that is going to help the businesses, yes, that they have expertise in, but that they're also heavily invested and conflicted by. Do I have that right?
Absolutely. Yeah, well, I think this is really largely about Elon Musk. I mean, Musk, by putting, a huge amount of money into Donald Trump's campaign and kind of egging along the industry, that it's given him and really his allies in Silicon Valley just a ton of influence that they did not have in 2016 when we saw like a handful of buddies of Peter Thiel get into sort of mid-level positions in the White House. This is something on another level. And Andreessen Horowitz, again, these are allies of Elon Musk, major investors in X, the old Twitter, investors in XAI, and also just with a huge stake in sort of the future of AI and the policy making around that.
Roger, what's your take on all this?
So I totally agree with Max, and he follows Elon Musk as closely as anyone on earth. To me, Silicon Valley has a very simple strategy here. There are two objectives. One is to lower taxes to nothing. And two is to have absolute freedom of action to do what they want to do. And that requires undermining the rights of workers, and it requires essentially having free rein to run massive experiments on the population. And the group of people we're talking about have been the architects of that strategy, starting with Musk, but these guys from Andreessen Horowitz are part of that as well. And they're going to run this gigantic experiment, and all of us are going to be on the pointy end of that particular spear.
But what do you say to those, Roger, who say, well, finally, we're going to have people in these positions who actually understand these industries, that understand the technologies, because before, members of Congress or, random people that are longtime bureaucrats, they don't even know the universes, the verticals that they're overseeing. Now, we're bringing experts in. What do you say to people who make that argument?
Well, I would say take a look at the products in Silicon Valley that you use every day, whether it's Google Search or Google Maps or Microsoft productivity applications or even Twitter, now called X. All of these products get worse every single year. That Silicon Valley's strategy over the last 15 years has essentially been to make their products adversarial to the people who use them in order to extract more wealth. That is not the way you want to run a government. And I would observe that, yes, these guys know a lot about AI. Yes, they know a lot about crypto. But I would argue that both AI and crypto are things that should be in a lab, not things that should be run as a giant experiment on the population. That there are a lot of reasons to believe that AI is not only disappointing relative to the amount of money that's been invested so far, but that it may, in fact, lead to all kinds of really perverse outcomes, such as kids using ChatGPT in school and therefore never really learning to think for themselves, never learning to do research or how to write. These are really important life skills that AI is going to take away. But if you're in a business where you want labor to be kept stupid and powerless, AI is exactly what you want. These guys are natural authoritarians, and they're drawn to Trump.
Well, let's talk about Trump, because there was a lot of reactions over the last week. Donald Trump had a good 5 days of hearing from folks referring to Elon Musk as President Musk. And I want to share what Donald Trump had to say about that over the weekend.
I like having smart people. They're on a new kick. Russia, 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 Ukraine, 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 all the different hoaxes. And the new one is President Trump has ceded the presidency to Elon Musk. No, that's not happening. He's not going to be president, that I can tell you. And I'm safe. You know why? He can't be. He wasn't born in this country.
Ha ha ha. He doesn't need to be president. He gets to be Darth Vader. He gets to be the Wizard of Oz, hiding behind the curtain, getting everything that he wants without any of the downside. How much longer do you think this love story is going to last, Max?
I mean, you know, what Trump seems to be saying there is he's my Darth Vader, right? He's actually sort of affirming the alliance and attempting to own it, attempting to sort of take advantage of this guy with a major media property, with a lot of money, a huge amount of money that he's willing to spend, and kind of a willingness to be on Trump's right flank, kind of corralling people. And there are lots of ways you could see that falling apart. Obviously, the ego thing, and you see that kind of poking through in the comments. There's a little bit of tension. It's not clear that Trump is kind of laughing at the joke or with the joke or kind of where he is. But for now, I'd say this alliance seems to be pretty healthy. You know, just seeing these tech figures who are pretty close to Elon Musk get jobs within the new administration is just further sign of that. Now, it's not like every single job in the Trump White House is going to a tech person, and so there will be. You know, there are tensions, clearly, but I would say I don't think we're anywhere near a breakup, despite all that happened over the last, 5 days or so.
Roger, what do you think?
So I look at this as a team that has a very clear agenda. They want to take taxes as low as possible. In order to pay for it, they're going to have to gut social for corporations, but also for individuals. Remember, Musk pays a lot. You know, he has a lot bigger potential tax bill than any corporation in America. So lower taxes is a huge deal, but also getting rid of Social Security and Medicare, cutting them dramatically in order to pay for those things is a core part of the plan. And I think a lot of the people who've been put forward as nominees are really a distraction to get us to focus on the outrage of whether it's Matt Gaetz or whomever as an alternative to focusing on what the real danger is that systems that we as American citizens have paid into for generations are going to be gutted by these people. They've been very plain that that's their goal. And I look at this and I go, I don't know what power we have to stop this, but whatever we have, we should be using it right now.
Well, here's the thing. There's all sorts of people who have looked at the math, who believe we need entitlement reform, that no Social Security is going to run out. That's true. However, all of these Congress people in every single state, when they try to go home and, dare I say, get reelected after they gut those systems, let's see how that works out for them.